Hi.
Hello.
Welcome to this week's Physiologic Yoga's online classroom. I took a deep breath there because I have a lot to say. There's a lot happening and I really don't know where to start. So, um, well, let's start with hopefully what's the beginning of the end of COVID. Um, Today, the theme that has been sort of chasing me and us, I think, well, as North America at least, uh, is polarity. I've been hearing a lot of talk about polarity um, in at least two subjects that are coming up for everyone. One is COVID. So let's start there. It was the first article that I read this week that I noticed the theme of polarity. So that I read an article by an infectious disease doctor um, talking about the pandemic and what's happening, especially in Ontario and Toronto, and seeing a bunch of people out, I guess, not respecting the social distancing rules. And he said it broke his heart. But his point was that social shaming doesn't help that, education helps that, and there doesn't need to be a choice between a healthy population and a healthy economy. There doesn't need to be this idea of one or the other. We can have both if we work together and educate the population. So I don't really have comments on that. I just noticed that was, I thought, a higher level of thinking, of social functioning that he was suggesting.
It almost seems like the conversation is divided a lot on political lines, which it shouldn't be, but it seems to be that way, um, which leads into the larger polarity
Yeah, which leads into our
conversation.
next conversation. And let me just say, like, I'm a physiotherapist, I'm a yoga instructor. I'm interested in what happens inside our bodies, not necessarily outside our bodies. Into sociology as well, psychology, but not necessarily politics. And that's where you come in. You've always been really interested in politics.
Very,
And
yes.
so we seem polarized a lot of the time when we come to the table about a certain uh, subject. And you were saying earlier that you actually realized that that theme of polarity, even though it looks like it's playing out when we talk, um,
Well, I think that we're coming to to the conversation with different perspectives um, on the subject, but we after conversation like from the outside it would seem that we're on opposite sides of the fence to say, but after we converse and really get to the heart of the matter, we find that despite the fact that we're coming at it from different perspectives, our our views at the heart of any issue are almost always the same, but it takes some really grounded conscious conversation to get to that point. And I think that's what is missing in most of these situations.
yeah, well said. And that's going to lead us into the style of meditation that we're going to do tonight, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the image that's coming to mind is like there's this thing here that we're both trying to talk about and trying to get at, which in a lot of situations is the best thing for everyone at the same time. And if one person's coming at it from over here and the other person's coming at it from over here, the perspectives are different. So it sounds like you're very far away because you are. You're sort of you're polarized, right? You're coming at it triangulated from 2 points that are far away, but you're trying to meet in the middle. And so when you talk about something from those polarized views, it's going to sound like you're far away until you get closer to the heart of the issue, like you said, and realize that we're all trying to achieve the same thing. So, in terms of the polarity on can we have both a healthy population and a healthy economy at the same time? Yes, they might sound like two totally opposite things, but both of them are trying to get at the same thing, which is just get us through this time as best as possible, as healthy as possible in all realms. So as the COVID thing ends, hopefully, as it sort of trickles down and we enter back into society, this whole thing with the uprising of racial injustice and police violence is happening, especially from our friends in the United States, but is waking up the whole world to talk about it. And the next article I read right after that one about COVID was the one that Barack Obama wrote about this subject. And I've posted that on the Physiologic Yoga page on Facebook. If you missed it, he's an incredible writer. That man was born to write. And his quote is, if we want to bring real change, then the choice isn't between protest and politics. We have to do both. And I've been hearing from so many friends, so many clients, so many people that they feel like it's time to take action. That's what's coming up. Even a prominent, very skilled yoga teacher in my community, who's a teacher of mine, commented that there is no meditating our way out of this injustice. And she felt called to write an article and write posts about injustice. So it's really sort of, people are feeling moved to act and to speak out, and to a point, I think in some communities where I've heard it said that outrage is actually hurting communities potentially as much as the racism is. So again, it's these polarized views. People are coming from two opposite ends of the spectrum, and hopefully there's this third triangulated point that we're moving towards, which is what, justice, acceptance, peace, right? But in response to the thing that we're trying to eradicate, the outrage can be as detrimental. So I have to disagree with the statement that there is no meditating our way out of this. And that's what we're going to do today. So we're going to talk a little bit about law of attraction, just a little bit. That's a really big subject, but the principles behind it that I like to practice are looking at things that, instead of what we're pushing against, instead of what we're trying to get rid of, right? When we look at something, it shows up more in our lives. It's sort of like a universal quantum law, but also you can just sort of think of an example and think, yeah, when you look for something, usually you notice it more. So instead of looking at pushing against injustice, pushing against racism, raising our voices louder than what racism is raising their voice as, or injustice is raising their voice as, turning towards the opposite polarity and saying, okay, when we push against those things, what is it that we wish to actually turn towards? So the opposite of injustice is justice. So sitting and feeling what that would be like, justice. Instead of violence, turn towards peace. Instead of racism, turn towards acceptance. So in that way, there is room for activism, just like Barack Obama's post said. I believe that. And I also believe that, actually I know for sure from my own experience that there is a lot of room as well for grounding and meditation and peace and quiet. And interestingly, when I went back to my friend, my yoga teacher's page to reference her quote, she had made another post and announcing a movement that I haven't heard the languaging around yet. So she's actually lives in the United States. I'm not sure if this is popular in Canada yet. I try to stay well away from the news and too much social media because it's something that does overwhelm me. And that's in my practice to sort of turn my attention towards well-being, to keep myself sane enough to be able to kind of act in the world. So excuse me if this is like out there already and people already know about this movement, but um, it's called muted and listening. And uh, so instead of speaking out against our outrage, against racism and police violence and injustice, um, muted and listening is a movement that is a chance to make space for what we're now calling melanated voices to speak. So, do you know what that word means?
Yes.
Melanated, yeah. Okay. Have you heard it before? Is this just me? Is this new to me and not anyone else?
I haven't heard it used. I haven't heard it used, but I know what it means.
Okay. So I haven't heard that term melanated voices, but here's your physiology lesson of the day. Melanin is the pigment in our cells that can cause like a tan. It's released by UV light and can make our skin darker when exposed to UV light. And it's present in different amounts and different concentrations in different races around the world. So the more melanin that your skin has released or has inherently in it, the darker your skin naturally is, and the less melanin that our skin naturally has, the lighter our skin is.
Like this.
Yeah.
Later.
we should spend a little more time outside. But so muted and listening, a chance to make space for melanated voices to speak. And so what that means to me is the less melanated voices, it's our time to quiet down. And that looks and sounds to me a lot like meditation. So this might be a chance for us to kind of simmer, lay back, and not act, but act in a way that promotes what we want the result, the end goal to be. So there is a space for activism, but I think that movement is saying there's also space for some silence. Any thoughts? Okay. Any thoughts? Feel free to comment. I might have mentioned this before. I have a minor in philosophy, so I'm very comfortable with rebuttals or arguments or well thought out paragraphs, that conversations. Questions, comments. If you have any more knowledge about this, please start a conversation. I would love to have a community talk around this. Because I know a lot of you individually have reached out and wanted to share and talk and maybe rant and rave and not quite know what to do with all of this stuff that's bubbling to the surface. So for right now, if you're able and you have time, we'll simmer down together. We're sitting on the floor just to literally evoke that sense of grounding. And grounding is really, I think, the most important first step, regardless of what your next step is, regardless of if your next action is to meditate or to be quiet or to go out into the world and write an article or join a protest or do some activist work. Because if we're not grounded, that's when we elevate our level of emotion, thank you, to a place that isn't necessarily useful or helpful. So if you're able to right now and you haven't yet, find a comfortable seat. If you're able to get on the floor, sit on the floor. Otherwise, the couch. If you want to lay flat out on the ground, if you have access to a yard, land, grass, earth. We watched a documentary called Earthing yesterday. It's about literally touching the ground and the soil, and that actually helps to decrease activation and inflammation in our body. So as close to grounding as you can get. Just let you settle in, and if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do. And just drop your shoulders. Allow your breath to settle a little lower into your body. Instead of being held up by your shoulders, feel your weight dropping into your seat or into the back of your body. And take a moment to notice whatever felt most flaring to you this week. Whether it was the continued fear around the COVID pandemic, or the grief surrounding what's happening in the States and around the world with racism, injustice, and violence. Take a moment to notice that. Sit in that polarity for a moment. It might take a couple seconds to think of the words that describe all the things you don't want about that, about those things. And then, almost like you're doing a mental 180, turn around and look towards the other end of the spectrum, the other polarity, where you want to end up. It might look really far away, because it is. Because when we're starting from one end, the other end is always the furthest point away. But as you slow your breath and calm your body, notice if that allows you to move towards the end of the spectrum that we're trying to arrive to. Instead of violence, calm. Instead of injustice, a breath towards justice. Instead of fear, a breath towards confidence. Instead of illness, a breath towards health. Instead of racism, a breath towards acceptance. Think of every breath like a step towards where we want to end up. Your exhales long. Your body grounded. We're going to take 3 more minutes in silence today with a conscious absence of Sandor's music to honor this idea of muted and listening. So I'll leave you with this little piece of information, and then we'll end with silence. When I first learned meditation, the best way that I heard the definition was that prayer is the asking, and meditation is the listening for the answer. So we've done a lot of asking this week. We'll take the next 3 minutes to listen for the answer. I know sometimes that our anger and outrage feel like action is required, and instead feel as though that this is the action that might be required. So I'll leave you to continue in your silence, if you like, muted and listening for as long as you have time for tonight. And as always, if you have questions or comments or need to have a personal conversation, please reach out. Leslie Watt. Namaste.